Hello and welcome to our podcast show, Inside Interiors with Croudace Constructs. Each episode we link up with industry experts who take us a little deeper into interior construction. We'll be chatting about the basics and the details, giving you the answers to your questions, no matter how involved you are within our industry. Whether it's about the latest design trends or guidance on who does what, we have your back. Let's get started.
Hello, welcome to the podcast, Inside Interiors with Croudace Constructs. Today we have Josh Biggs from Harris Real Estate on with us. Hi, Josh.
Hi, Steph. How you going?
Good, thank you. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm obviously with Harris Real Estate. I do a combination of residential and commercial sales predominantly, but also in that leasing and management of commercial properties as well. So we're based in the Stirling office. I've been up here for about just over 20 years.
Yeah, right. And so you have another office in the city as well, Harris?
Yeah, look, our main Harris office is at Kent Town. That's our head office there. We've got Stirling office, Blackwood, and also Glenelg. So 4 offices in total.
Quite a big company then.
Yeah, it is. It's grown a lot, predominantly residential, and we don't specialise in commercial a lot, mostly residential leasing and sales.
Yeah.
But yeah, the company's grown dramatically. It's only been going 10 years, but it's, we've got pretty good market share now.
Yeah, great. So if I use myself as an example and I wanted to go out, open a retail store or rent an office, basically, Where would I start? I'm someone who has no experience in commercial leasing. So basically, who would I go speak to? Where would I start?
Yeah, I guess it's firstly, as a tenant, a matter of working out where you want to be. I guess if it's retail, there's certain spots that you want to be and you'd identify that first. If it's office accommodation, you probably don't need to be so specific on location. But I guess initially the research you'd want to be doing is around where you're going to want to open. And once you've done that, I guess it's really a matter of just seeing from an agent point of view who's active in that area. Yep. The best site to go to for any sort of commercial opportunities is realcommercial.com.au, which is basically a subsidiary of realestate.com. It's the commercial aspect of realestate.com. So Real Commercial is where you'd start and just start researching on what you're looking for, the size shop, and that's the key thing, probably to work out how many square meters you need, because it's your costs and everything is to do with square meters in commercial. It's very different than residential letting where you're looking at, I guess, 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms or whatever it might be. It's all about square meters that you need, and then it's also that's reflective in cost as well, because the cost of your leasing is all about a square meter rate. So once you've identified where you want to be, Real Commercial is a good starting point. But then not dissimilar to buying a house or leasing a house, you build up a rapport with some agents and they'll definitely let you know what they've got coming up as well. There's probably only half a dozen really active agents in Adelaide or agencies. So you really just want to work with those closely once you've worked out where you want to be.
Yeah, great. What about, how would I avoid any surprises? So as I mentioned, someone with no experience in commercial leasing, things like, would the price go up? What would affect the price I'm paying, I guess, for the lease? Anything like that?
Yeah, I think if you're really green and starting out and you haven't had any experience with leases, there are companies in Adelaide who represent the tenants. There's tenancy advocates who will know all of that. So depending on the size of what you're embarking on, that might be something to consider, having someone, I guess, represent you and help you with that. Yeah. Because alternatively, if you're going to go into it yourself, you'd probably want to try to ask one of the agents that you're dealing with or that you see, maybe just to get a copy of a draft lease and start reading about what a draft lease might be. And there's also what we call a heads of agreement or an agreement to lease. So that holds the key parts to your tenancy, and then the formal lease is a much more lengthy document. But to start to read and understand those sort of aspects of a lease are really important. So as you just sort of asked, like how the rents might increase. So your rents can increase generally by CPI every year. Yep. So normally you'd sign a lease of 2, 3, 4, anything up to 5-year lease. And each year in that you'd have a possibility of a CPI increase for rent. But in addition to that, you generally pay what's called outgoings as well. So you've got a rental component, and your outgoings cover off things like council rates, water rates, strata fees, those sort of things. So a tenant generally in a commercial lease is responsible for that as well. So when you see leases advertised, there'll be a rent figure, you'll see it advertised at, and then it will generally be including outgoings or plus outgoings. So they're the two things you need to know. What's my rent and what are my outgoings likely to be? So does that make sense? You've sort of got two costs as a tenant.
Yeah, sure. And so are there any other factors that you might have to consider before going into a lease?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the getting a really clear understanding on your rent and your outgoings is probably the first step. The length of lease is a really critical one, because particularly if you're starting a new business, then you really probably want a slightly shorter term to start with, but with some options then to extend if it goes really well. But clearly the landlord's going to want probably a longer lease. So you just have to know the length of lease is something that's really negotiated, very different than residential where they're generally all just 12-month leases, just renewing every year. Commercial is quite different to that. So we have a lot of businesses we've leased premises to that would take out maybe a 2-year lease to start. And then at the end of that 2-year lease, if they are heading in the right direction, they might have a 3-year option after that. So it would be what we call a 2+3. The total is a 5-year lease, but if it doesn't go to plan after 2 years, then the tenant would have the right to not extend that lease if they didn't want to. It's a tenant right, not a landlord right.
Sure. And have you noticed a change, obviously with COVID-19, with lease agreements and the length? Are landlords offering shorter agreements or? Yeah,
not so much. We haven't seen changes with the length of leases, because what you have to imagine is most leases are in place already before COVID happened. So your lease is there in place. We've obviously helped a lot of tenants through the last 6 months with COVID, but it hasn't really changed the length of leases. Most people now are wanting COVID clauses in their leases. If we're negotiating with new people to start, then that's a real common talking point at the moment as to what a COVID condition in a lease might look like. Most tenants now want something sort of in writing in that lease to say what would happen if we went back into lockdown in that area, or if that state got affected as it has previously, what would happen then? Because we really had to rely on what was put out by the government as a code of conduct with COVID, the recommendation, whereas if it's in the lease, it's far more straightforward. So we haven't seen a change of length of lease with COVID, but we have certainly seen a change with new leases and what the COVID clause might look like.
Yeah, sure. And what about sort of the number of people taking on new leases? Do you think there's been a bit of a drop in?
I mean, I think the commercial space, depending on your industry, has seen some changes. I mean, we've really had to nurse through a number of tenants through our last 6 months, particularly in the hospitality sector, where they were shut down or under heavy restrictions with seating. So that has seen some changes from a point of view of tenant viability, and that's inevitably leading to sort of people closing down. I mean, where we work here in Stirling, there are a few businesses in the tourism industry that have closed down, so there's vacancies that wouldn't normally be here in the town that are now because of COVID. So that will then affect rents, because people need to drop rents to get tenants in. So COVID has a bit of a longer term effect on commercial real estate, but we've seen that starting already, definitely.
Yeah. And I read something recently that said landlords have more pressure on them to sort of have a premises ready to go. So basically, put more effort into their fit out, because tenants aren't wanting to fit out a premises if then, with the risk of things changing. And
it's a really interesting point, that, because the challenge for the perception is that a landlord's got the money. He's the one with owns the property. He can afford half rent or whatever it might be. But there's a lot of, we look after properties for landlords who just own one commercial property, and they're a mum and dad investor. And we look after some which are far bigger than that have got 10 or a dozen commercial properties. So every landlord is different, like every tenant is different, and they don't necessarily have the ability just to waive rent for 6 months. So a lot of them can't afford to do that. The next thing that leads to is then when their property becomes vacant, yes, you do have to make it more attractive to people to lease the premises. And what is very different from a commercial sense to residential is when it's residential, you lease, you want it in good condition when you go into it.
Yeah.
With a commercial tenancy, you really just lease the building, and that can be just an empty shell. And then what you do with it is really up to you as the commercial tenant. So what we're seeing now is instead of rent-free periods, we're seeing, sharing fit-out costs is becoming more common. There's a lot more incentives being put in place for a landlord, from a landlord to a tenant, to get that right tenant. So that fluctuates in any market, but in the market we're going into now, it's sort of what they're calling a lot of COVID normal environment. It's going to be much more common where the incentives are going to be higher for tenants, and that's what, in this example where you're looking to find something, say as a retail space, you need to sort of speak to agents out there and find out what's the going rate, what's expected. Can I get 3 months free rent? Can I get 6 months free rent? Is 50% fit out possible, or is that fair in this market? But that then also comes back to the length of lease, because your landlord's not going to give you 6 months free if you sign just a 1 year lease to start. It's going to have to. It's all about the term of lease and what the fit out is that you're putting into it as well. So there's so much more just to negotiate than just that rent figure. Yeah,
of course. So if I did rent a new premises and I wanted to fit it out, how does that work? So are there things within a lease that sort of says what I am and am not allowed to do within a fit out?
Yeah, sure. So what you normally do in that is you normally put forward a proposal, like an agreement to lease with what you're wanting to do to the property. That needs to all be approved by the landlord. So the landlord gets total approval on your works. In most tenancies, it's the tenant responsibility to coordinate that and pay for that fit out. So that's what we're going to now, where we're not seeing as many businesses starting fresh or moving and refitting out properties given the current economic climate. So landlords are definitely providing some incentives there and help to do that. But when you come into a lease, you would pretty much explain what you want to do. You'd get some costings together on what your fit out would cost, and then you'd sit down and negotiate that with the agent or the landlord as part of your negotiation on rent, length of term, all of that, all included in one.
So generally a tenant, it's up to them. So they're walking into a bit of a blank.
Pretty much. Commercial tenancies, you pretty much just lease a shell. You lease, and sometimes if the tenant's moved out previously that might have used the space, say it's an office, and they've used it as an office, the previous tenant, then quite often it will already be partitioned into separate rooms, and you might have a reception counter, and all those things might be there already, your kitchen for staff, all that. But there's other tenancies where they're just, the change of use, perhaps it was an office and it now becomes retail. Well, that ends up being completely stripped bare and start again. That is generally a tenant expense to do that. So quite different than a residential tenancy in that way. But obviously in that case, if you spend the money on putting all those things in, then it's also expected that you would take them out at the end if the next person doesn't want it. So we've just taken possession of a building which has been left empty, and obviously they've stripped everything out completely. Everything's gone. It's basically back to floor and walls, and then the next tenant will come in and set up how they want to do.
And what if it's within a shopping centre, so say a Westfield? Are there different rules again with that? I understand they have their own sort of rules with what you can do.
I mean, Westfield's one that you need to get different advice on again. The Westfield or the bigger shopping centres, without sort of saying specific names, but the bigger shopping centres have their own agreements, their own certain requirements. So you really want to get some very clear independent advice on a possible lease arrangement in those sort of shopping centres, because they will vary from a standard lease arrangement. I mean, I haven't obviously been involved as a tenant in a Westfield or something similar. I've only sort of got sort of the industry knowledge of what I've been told you would have to be aware of, but it probably is a different mentality as a landlord-tenant relationship than it would be if you're in like a smaller shopping centre of say 8 or 10 shops, that are like a suburb type sort of shopping centre. That again, that's about knowing the building you're going into and also getting that information from the agent that you need.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for your time. I think that's been a great insight into commercial leasing. Covered all the basics of, for someone starting out who may not know anything about commercial leasing. yeah, I think that's a really great start. So thanks again for your time.
No problem. I can't recommend enough just to get someone independent to help you through it. That's the important thing. Get someone who can help you as an advocate in negotiating the best arrangement for you as a tenant.